Hello, welcome to another exciting tutorial with me, Romy Fauzi. In this video, we are going to continue our 2D platform with Playmaker series, and now I'm going to explain how to create health system for the player. So before we start, I'm going to explain some of the changes that I've made since our last video. So here inside the animations, I've created a new animations for the robot dad. And basically the robot dad is actually a dead animation, and I'm going to show you here. If I go to the animation window, it just plays the dead animation, and the dead animations is included in the sprite pack, so you can create it yourself. And for the animator, I've added the dead state here, and I've just created a new transition from any state to the dead state using the dead trigger. So you can just create a new trigger and then call it dead, and for the transition, just add that trigger to the condition and make sure has exit time is unchecked. Okay, so yeah, the other thing that we need to modify is the tag here. If I go to the tag settings, you see I've added the enemy tag, so just go ahead, do this yourself, and we are set to go. Okay, now let's start to create the mechanics. Here on the enemy game object, I'm going to edit the prefabs. And basically, I'm going to add a new FSM for the stats of the enemy. So in order to do that, let's just go to the Playmaker window and then add new FSM. For the FSM, I'm going to call this stats. And this FSM is not going to do anything other than to hold variables. So I'm going to create an integer variables, and I'm going to call this damage value. For now, let's just set this to 1. Okay, now let's head out from the enemy prefabs and now go to the player game object, and under the Playmaker editor we want to create a new FSM. So I'm going to add the new FSM, and for this FSM I'm going to call this health, and I'm going to prepare some variables here. So basically I'm going to create 2 integer. The first is the health and the second one will be the current health. And the health is the one that we are going to expose in the inspector, so you can just check this option here. And I'm going to set the value to maybe 2 for now, but we can change this later. And let's just minimize all of the FSM here. And under the health, let's just expand the control so we can see the health integer variables. And now under the state here, I'm going to rename this to init. And I'm going to use the set integer value to copy the health settings to the current health. So basically, the health is the settings that we want to set on the inspector for each of the enemy. But for calculating health, we want to use the current health. So I'm going to copy this value. I'm going to set the current health value using the set integer value to the health value here. And let's just add a finish transition and add a new state here. And let's just call the second state wait for enemy hit, and let's just connect this here. And now we want to add a collision to the event as well the trigger to the event. For the tag, we are going to pick enemy on both of the action, and we need to send an event. So let's just create a new event. I'm going to call this enemy hit. I'm going to add a new transition, enemy hit, and we want to set the send event value to that new event that we've just created. Also, we want to store the collider. So let's just create a new variable and let's just call this last enemy. So this is the game object that hit our player. And now we want to add a new state and connect the enemy hit to this new state here. We can rename the state to subtract health. And for the state here, we want to create 2 new events. The first one will be the finish event, and the other one we need to add a new event. So I'm going to add a new dead event and add that transition also. I'm going to connect the finish state back to the wait for enemy hit. And here basically we want to calculate the damage. So in order to do that, we want to add a new get FSM integer, and we want to get the integer from the enemy entity, which is the damage value. So in order to do that, we can just set the game object use owner to specify game object here, and then pick the last enemy that hit us. So it would be this variable here. And for the FSM name, we can check on the enemy. I believe it's called stats. So, and the variable, let's just take a look here. And for the variable, it's called damage value. So let's go back to our player. And on the state here, we can just type the FSM name, which is stats. And for the variable name, it's damage value. And we want to store this to a new variable. So let's just create a new variable and let's give it the same name, which is damage value. And now we want to calculate the health. So we can just use an in operator, and we want to subtract the current health with the damage value that we've just acquired from the enemy. And use the subtract operation, and for storing the result, we want to store this back to the current health. Here, after we calculate the health, we want to compare the value. So if the health is 0, then we want to go to the dead state here. So let's just add an in compare. And for the first integer, we want to set this to the current health. And the second one, leave it to 0. And if it's equal, we want to go to the dead event. Or if it's less than, we want to go to the dead event. Now we want to create a new state. And let's just call this dead. And for the dead state, we want to trigger an animator trigger. And now we need to pick the game object that has the animator, which is the child robot game object here. And for the trigger, we want to trigger the dead trigger. And we want to also set the velocity to the back to 0. So let's just set this X and Y to 0. And here we want to destroy the rigid body and the capsule collider component, so it doesn't interfere in our scene anymore. But before that, I'm going to disable all of the other FSM. So let's just use the enable FSM action, and we can just set the game object to use owner. But for the FSM name, we need to specify this to the movement and uncheck both of the option here, the enable and reset exit. So this will disable it. And I'm going to copy this by pressing Ctrl C, and then I'm going to Ctrl V a couple of times. And the second one would be the direction. And the third one should be the jumping. And we want to also disable the shooting. Okay, so we have disabled all of the other FSM on our player. Now we want to use the destroy component. And then we can just pick the capsule collider 2D component here. And we can just copy this component. And we want to pick the rigid body. So I think it's down below here. Yes. Okay, so now we finished the dead state. Let's just connect this here. And for the subtract health, if the player is not dead, then we want to continue do some actions below here. So the first thing that we want to use is the get scale action, and we want to grab the direction currently the player is facing. So we can just grab the X scale. And I'm going to create a new variable. Let's just call this direction. And under the variables, I'm going to create a new float value. And I'm going to call this bounce value. And for the bounce value, I'm going to set this to -5. And we want to create a bounce effect whenever we hit the enemy. And here we want to use a float multiply action. And we want to multiply the bounce value with the direction that we've just grabbed from the get scale here. So this is basically will flip the value whenever the player is facing right or left. And then we want to use the add force to the action. And we want to set the bounce value to the X component. And for the Y value, we can just set a fixed value. I'm going to set this to 3. And you can experiment with the values here. And I'm going to set the force mode to impulse. And here I want to also add a bling effect. So we can just use the bling effect. And since the sprite render is on the child object, I'm going to change the game object to specify game object and then drag the robot game object. So the blink will modify the renderer to turn off the renderer and on with a set of interval time here based on the time off and the time on option. So I'm going to set this to 0.15. And whenever we go back to the wait for enemy hit here, add a set visibility action, and we want to set the visibility back on the robot game object here, because the subtract health state may exit while the renderer is still blinking. So we need to make sure when it returns to the wait for enemy hit state, the visibility is back on. So here I'm going to also add a wait action. And basically we want to wait for a couple of seconds. For example, we want to wait for 5 seconds and then we want to go to the finish event. So basically whenever we get hit by the enemy and if the player is not dead, then we want to blink the player for 5 seconds and also the player will be invincible. So the enemy cannot hurt us in 5 seconds. And then after that, we can go back to the state here where the enemy can damage us again. Okay, so yeah, here on the wait for enemy hit, we need to set the visibility back on, back visible, and I'm going to uncheck the reset on exit option. But I'm going to specify the game object here and then drag the robot game object and save this. Now there is also one thing that we need to fix. Whenever we apply this add force, this will get cancelled out right away by the movement here, because with the movement we are setting the velocity every frame. So we need to ignore this for a couple of seconds whenever we got hit by the enemy. In order to do that, I'm going to create a new state here and I'm going to call this enemy hit, and I'm going to create a new event called hit, and I'm going to make sure that this event is a global event. So you can just check this option here if you haven't done so, and then we can add a global transition hit to this enemy hit state here, and I'm going to add a finish local transition here. We can connect the finish transition to the movement, and basically we want to wait for a very short time in the state here. So I'm going to add a wait action again, and I'm going to set this value to perhaps half second. And when finished, we want to go to the finish transition, go back to the movement state here. Okay, now let's head back to the health FSM. And whenever we get hit by the enemy here, we want to send an event to the movement FSM. So I'm going to use the send event here, and I'm going to put the send event above the get scale here, below the in compare. And I'm going to pick the game object FSM for the event target, and we want to use the owner, and for the FSM name we can pick the movement, and we want to send the hit event here. And now I'm going to save the scene here, and for the enemy I'm going to modify its tag. So I'm going to open the enemy, go to the enemy entity here, and I'm going to set the tag to enemy. Okay, I'm going to save this again, and let's select the player. I'm going to highlight the current health here. So let's just press play, and you'll see that the current health will be set to the health value on start. And let's just try to hit the enemy. There you go. Now our current health is 1, and we are blinking, and you see that we have the bounce effect. And now if we get hit once more, now we are dead, and we don't have the rigid body and capsule collider anymore, so we cannot shoot, we cannot move, and we cannot do anything else here. Now let's continue create the health bar for the player. I've already also prepared another sprite, which is a battery sprite, and this is basically a square image with transparency. You can search yourself on the web, and here we want to create a new image under the UI, and it will automatically create a new canvas. I'm going to set the scale with screen size under the canvas scaler and set this to a full HD resolution. I'm going to set the screen match mode to match width or height and set the value to 0.5. Here, if we extend to the canvas here, I'm going to modify the image first. So this will be the health bar. We can just rename this to health bar. And I'm going to remove the image component. And we can just set this to perhaps around 400 in width and maybe 75 on height, and we can just adjust this later. And we want to create a new child object, which is also an image, and we want to stretch this child object to fill the size of our health bar. So I'm going to pick the transform here option and then hold the Alt button and then choose the most bottom left icon here. And now with this setup, I'm going to pick the battery image as the sprite of our image game object here. And as you can see, our battery is stretched. I'm going to set the image type to tiled, and now it's tiled. And we can just crop the pixel per unit multiplier until we get the repetition that we wanted. So here in this case, I'm going to set this to a 5 repetition. So I think this 6.5 value should be enough. And under the health bar game object, which is the parent game object, I'm going to add a slider component. And I'm going to set the fill rectangle to the child object here. So let's just drag the child object to this fill rect option. And if we scrap the value here, you see that we can just add or decrease the battery here. And I'm going to set the max value to 5. So it equals with our battery amount. And let's just set the whole numbers to true. So this will be a step slider. It's not going to be a float slider. Okay, now we have set this up. We can reposition this to be on the top left of our screen here. So here under the rect transform, we can just select this rect transform option. And if we press Alt, we can choose this one here. And it will put it here. But we can just give it a offset from the edge of our screen here. And now if we see in the game view, you can see the battery icon here. Okay, so we have set up the health bar here. And now if we select the player, go to the health FSM. Under the subtract health state, when we subtract our health here using the integer operator, we want to add a UI slider set value action. So let's just add this, and I'm going to put this action below the integer operator and above the in compare here. We want to set the value to our current health. So we need to pick this convert here and pick the current health, because the value basically asks for float and our current health is integer, so we need to convert this, and Playmaker will do this automatically. And for the game object, we want to specify the game object, and we can just drag the health bar game object from our hierarchy to the game object slot here. And then the other thing that we want to set is under the variable for the health integer value, we want to set this to also 5. So this will be synchronized with the battery amount on our screen here. And if you want to set this to a different value, you need to modify the health bar so it will show the same amount of battery with our health here. Okay, let's save this and let's give it a try. And now you'll see that whenever we hit an enemy, our battery will get subtracted. So let's just try to collide with the enemy. And there you go. Now we have 4 batteries, and if we collide again, you see we have 3 batteries, and so forth. So that is basically how we create a player health and also the health bar UI. Thanks a lot for watching, and if you like this video, hit that like button and do subscribe. And in the next video, I'm going to try to explain how to create an enemy that can shoot a projectile. See you in the next video. Bye.